Okay, students. Tan, tadan, tan, tan. That's right. Factoring trinomial in full effect. All right. I'm going to really take my time with this one. Try to talk slowly so you can soak this up. So, of course, this is called a trinomial because it's a three-term polynomial. Okay? One, two, three. And of course, it's an expression. So we're factoring this expression. Moving forward, as we get more into factoring, we'll be solving equations by factoring. So where you'll have this expression equal to 0, and you'll have to solve for x. But now let's begin. So here we go. Remember, factoring is converting terms into factors. So when we're done with this expression, done factoring, our solution should look something like this. One factor times another factor. All right? So let's get down to business. Now, when factoring a trinomial, what we want to do is the first thing we want to do is we want to convert our three terms into four terms. And why is that? We want to convert these three terms, the trinomial, into a four-term polynomial, right? Because we know how to factor four terms by grouping, right? Because we know how to factor four terms by grouping. Now, the reason why I'm writing notes, it's because I'm trying to cater for all learners, the visual learner and the read-write learner. So some things that some of my students do is that they actually rewrite what they see in the video, because really and truly what I want to do is capture these videos the way you would capture me in the classroom. But in this time, most times, just hearing my voice, the way I talk, and my technique. So we want to convert three terms into four terms because we know how to factor by grouping. Remember in my last video, we had four terms and we factor by grouping because we group the first two terms, then the second two terms, and then we factor individual terms by finding the GCF for individual terms, pulling out another common factor, and ending up with our final answer. So that's what we're going to do here. That's what that was leading you up to. The first time we show you how to factor two terms, then we showed you how to factor four terms. Now we're showing you how to factor three terms. Now I know it sounded a little backwards. Like, why did we go from 2 to 4 to 3? That's because that we have to know how to factor four terms before we can actually factor three terms. So like, again, I said I'm going slow, so forgive me if I'm taking long to get with it. I know sometimes when I'm looking at how-to videos on YouTube, I'm like, shut up and get with it. So somebody's probably saying that right now. All right, let's get with it. So how do I convert my three terms into four terms? So we do that first by finding the product of the first term, and let me write out the word term, and third term. So I'm going to find a product of 15x squared and negative 8, right? Now, usually it works out in hindsight that you just need to find the product of the coefficients, right? And the reason why I refer to 8 as a coefficient, because there's actually a x0 there. But technically, that's probably not the correct thing to say. -8 is not a coefficient, but we use the constant term and the coefficient of the first term, and we could find the product of that, and we're able to figure out our two factors that we're going to make a fourth term with. Now, the whole goal of finding the product of the first and the second term, right? Oh boy, excuse me, is that we want to find two factors of this product that will equal the middle term. All right, we want to find two factors of the product of the first and the third term that equals the middle term when you combine them. So it sounds weird. We're going to have to multiply these two to find two factors that when we add or subtract them, it equals the middle term. Okay, so let's start there first. So we find the product of the first and the third term. So that's 15x squared times -8. And we know that a positive and a negative equals a negative. So my product here is going to be negative. Now, -15 times 8, 15 times -8 is actually 40, what's that, 120, right? 8 times 5 is 40, 8 times 1 is 8, and 4 is 12, -120x squared. Now, this is a super big number that we have to find factors that will equal 14. Now, something that you must know is that there's a positive 14. So there's a couple rules you should know when it comes to science, because that's what confuses students a lot. The first thing you should know that if you multiply your first and third term and the product is positive, then you either have two positive factors or two negative factors, because like signs equals positive. So a positive times a positive is a positive, and a negative times a negative is a positive, right? So again, if you multiply the first term and the third term and it equals a positive, then it must mean that your two factors are either two positives or two negatives. Now, if you multiply, now how would you know the difference? How would you know if you're going to use in two positives or two negatives? What your goal is that your factors, when you combine them, that means add or subtract them, it must equal the sign of the middle, right? When you combine your factors, it must equal the sign of the middle, right? So that means if this was a -14 and my product was positive, then it means I would have had to have two negative factors to get me -14, because you add like signs and keep the sign. So another thing to know is that if your product is positive, then you must add to find your middle term, right? So if you multiply the first and the third and it's a positive, it means that you must add to find the middle term. So that means you're either adding two positive numbers or adding two negative numbers. Now, if you multiply and the product is negative, if your product is negative, that means one factor is negative and one factor is positive, because a negative times a positive is a negative. So what usually happens, you have to now ask yourself, well, which factor is going to be negative and which factor is going to be positive? So here's the next hint. The larger factor takes the sign of the middle term. Why is that? Because when you're combining those factors, you remember when it's positive, you add. When it's positive, you add. Well, guess what happens when it's negative? You must subtract to find your middle term. You must subtract to find your middle term. And what we know about the rules of subtraction when it comes to signs is that you subtract and keep the sign of the greater magnitude. That's why your larger factor that you're going to pick between the two will have the sign of the middle term. Good. So let's get back to our problem. So here we go. We have 15x squared times negative 8 is negative 120. So here we have a negative product. That means that one of my factor is positive and one of my other factor is negative, because when you multiply unlike signs, you get a product that's negative. But in this case, we need to subtract to find our middle term. So if we look at this, because I did this advanced, if we look at this, 20 times 6 is 120, right? Or we could say 20x times 6x would actually be 20x squared. Now, why didn't I say 20x squared times 6? Because remember, I'm trying to combine to get my middle term, and my middle term is 14x. I cannot combine a 20x squared and a plus 6. You cannot combine unlike terms. They have to be the same. So we know that if we find a product of 20x and 6x, we will get negative 120x squared, positive and negative. Now, why did I choose 20 as positive and not negative? Is because remember I said that when it's negative, you keep the sign of the larger factor takes the sign of the middle. So the middle is positive. So my larger factor is taking the sign of the middle, because when I subtract them, I keep the sign of the greater magnitude, I will get positive 14x. Right? But the goal is not to get back positive 14x. The goal is that I am supposed to take my product, the factors of my product, and split the middle term into two terms. So that's my next step, right? So take the factors of my product and split the middle term into two terms. So my new expression reads, my new expression is going to read, so here I take the factors of my product, right? The factors of my product was 20x, positive 20x, and negative 6x, right? And I split the middle term into two terms because we recognize that their difference is the middle term. So now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this. So now my 14x is now going to look like this. So now my problem is 15x squared plus 20x minus 6x minus 8. So now here it is. I have my my trinomial expression, or my three-term polynomial expression, is now converted into my four-term polynomial expression. And now I can factor by grouping. You could feel free to revisit the other videos to see what factor by grouping looks like, but for the sake of this video, I like to keep my videos under 15 minutes, and this is already looking like it's about to exceed it. But anyway, I'll perform this quickly. So I will combine my first two terms. Remember what happens when the negative comes outside the parentheses in the previous video? This is now 6x, positive 6x, the opposite, and positive 8. So and then I'll factor my individual group. Please refer to the video factoring by grouping. So here we go. So what's common between these two? 5x. And what's my remaining factor? So my GCF for this group is 5x, and my remaining factor is 3x plus 4. And my GCF between 6x and 8 is 2, and my remaining factor is 3x plus 4. And again, refer to your video so you know how I got my remaining factor. Remember, I take my GCF and I divide the original expression, original terms, and whatever's remaining factor is what will be in my parentheses. And I know I'm on the right track if I have these two as the same factor. So I can finally factor out a 3x plus 4, and my remaining factor is 5x minus 2. All right. Next video, I will show more examples of this. This is just my part 1.